Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Vernon Neppe, behavioral neurologist, neuropsychiatrist, but more importantly, consciousness researcher and dimensional biopsychophysicist. Many of you may have been following our ostensibly important model where we were able to derive mathematically a nine-dimensional finite spin reality. Now, the question comes up, what do these 9 dimensions consist of? And whereas we do not have the kind of mathematical proof that we have for this derivation, we do have some somewhat solid data where we are postulating that the first 3 dimensions, space, can be mathematically represented in real numbers. The next 3 dimensions, time, can be represented in imaginary numbers, and the following 3 dimensions, consciousness, can be represented as complex numbers, in other words, a combination of real and imaginary numbers. Just to clarify that, it's not that it runs first the 3 of space, then the 3 of time, and the 3 of consciousness. These are very much interwoven. Now, during a recent meeting of the Seattle Consciousness, Education and Research Society, SCRS, we discussed the problem of how does one explain 3-dimensional time. Specifically, I pointed to the idea of life tracks, where possibly we were like a tree, where we could make decisions at certain points and turn off in terms of tracks, and therefore change our reality, and that this was not dependent on our 3 dimensions of space and 1 moment in time reality, but in fact it reflected what will turn out to be the 3rd dimension of time, the volumetric dimension of time. So let's bear in mind the idea of life tracks. And the other component to bear in mind is the fact that we certainly have a dimension of time in terms of past, present, and future. And the only one we rarely experience is that single moment in time that we call the present. The present now is the future in 5 seconds' time, and was the past 5 seconds ago. But that whole continuity reflects a linear point, a line. When we now dream, we're no longer in clock time, or when we meditate, or maybe when people go out of body, they experience a different kind of time relationship. And if we were to put together these different kinds of time in terms of a mathematical graphing, it would be difficult, in fact impossible, to show it only as a single linear dimension. It would be a plane, and therefore 2-dimensional. And if we were to throw in the 3rd component of free will, limited free will, in this life track, not in the whole infinite reality, we would be talking 3-dimensionality of time, in other words, a volumetric idea. Let me clarify one other important point. Can time move backwards. Now here we may be talking about an ostensible linear time. We've mentioned how time inexorably, certainly in our 3 dimensions of space and 1 moment in time, always moves forward. It moves from the present to the future, which has now then become a present. We can remember the past. We may have vivid ideas about that past, but ostensibly we cannot go backwards. But let us imagine going backwards in time. Well, we go back to the grassy knoll in terms of the JFK assassination. Could we have changed the whole basis there? Could we have moved the life tracks and changed the tree and changed all of history and created a different kind of world? Some would talk about a parallel universe, a parallel experience, a real change in terms of history. So there is an added component. Could one change history? Could one prevent the Titanic happening? Could one change the absolute sadness of the Holocaust? Could one take another life track, but going backwards in terms of time? And how does this imply 3-dimensional time? Now this gives one background of the way you could explain time. And I asked my co-researcher, the very prominent mathematician and physicist, developer of the calculus of distinctions and of dimensional extrapolation, Dr. Edward Close, the question of how he conceptualized time. And he mentioned his experience some time ago with the great Dr. Stephen Hawking, when he was talking about a book that is now out of print, Dr. Edward Close's book, Infinite Continuity. Let's hear now from Dr. Close and his idea about multi-dimensional time. Do bear in mind that this was during a meeting, and so some of the background may reflect the spontaneity of the whole phenomenon.
But the manuscript of my book, Infinite Continuity, and in it I showed mathematically that there should be 3 dimensions of time, and Stephen's reply was that he couldn't imagine 3 dimensions of time, and I thought this was a remarkable statement for someone who can imagine black holes and white holes and warp space and time. But at any rate, my personal conception of 3-dimensional time actually encompasses the things we're talking about, in my opinion, rather nicely, because if you think of reality that we experience as being as Vernon mentioned, life track or timeline, which was my term for it in infinite continuity, that we create a timeline by drawing distinctions. We do this at a quantum level, so it's not something that we're totally conscious of, because we're not set up in our physical vehicles to see or experience things that are 40 magnitudes of size below what we can experience directly. But at that level, if you think of your life or anyone's life in terms of a timeline that is created by the drawing of distinctions, then even two people will create a plane from the point of view of dimensionometry, so that you have two dimensions. And it's not just because you have two people, it's because time is now going along on two different lines. They can be linear, they don't have to be linear, but we see them and think of them as linear. And we only experience the exact same thing as someone else if we happen to coincide on that timeline, and that would be presumably a little more for people who are in constant contact with each other, like a husband and wife or brother and sister or so forth. But then when you look at this plane and you think that there is a third dimension, then from that third dimension, just like in 3 dimensions of space, if you were able to actually leave the 2 dimensions of time, you would see both of the tracks. And extending this, then, every plane has an infinite number of lines in it, and so if there is a historical line that is in the consciousness of the group of people that experience it, like a historical event, the types that you've been talking about, then they are there, and unfortunately they will always be there. The time travel, even if you traveled, well, let me put it this way. If you traveled back in time and you were consciously at the grassy knoll or consciously in Berlin or at Berchtesgaden in 1943, you would be, first of all, unable to change anything because, number one, if you were in a physically material body, you would be violating the law of conservation and mass and energy. So if you were there, you would have to be there as a person who existed in that domain, and you would also have the consciousness and the awareness of that person, not the person you are now. So you would have the same thoughts and ideas that that person would have had at that time. So there would be no way you might be trying. I might be part of a group trying to change things, trying to assassinate Hitler or whatever, but you would be unsuccessful. On the other hand, if you're traveling there as a non-form, energy only, where there's no mass and thus no inertia, and no angular momentum, and Vernon, this is just a side comment on the direction of travel. This is why angular momentum is so important in subatomic physics as opposed to linear motion. But at any rate, if you were there at that historical moment, the grassy knoll or whatever, you might be fully aware of what was going on, but you would have no power to intervene or do anything because you would not have an inertial or physical body in that reference frame.
It's an excellent comment, Ed, and I'm just going to amplify one thing in relation to it. Again, we're talking about a 9-dimensional spin model. So if one goes backwards in terms of backward time, maybe along another time dimension, maybe even along that first time dimension, but we've said that there are 9 dimensions and you've got 3s1t. 3s1t, I refer here to 3 dimensions of space and 1 moment in time. And this is part of what we are postulating is the broader finite reality of these 9 spinning dimensions. There is some mathematical support for these being 3 of space, 3 of time, as in this discussion, and 3 of consciousness. And the consciousness becomes a higher level because as one moves across these higher dimensions, the consciousness manifests more and more. Let's return to 3S1T. One is not traveling back on conventional 3S1T, and that 1T is, we write it as a small t, we don't write it as a capital T, because we say it's one moment in time, as opposed to present, past, and future all being the whole one dimension. So we're traveling back, maybe even on 3S1T, big T, but we're not on the same base. We're not within that fabric where things could change. On the other hand, we have that Superman parallel of now we're traveling back in a second time or in another kind of time dimension, and we're moving back and we make another choice. Well, this is our new different reality. And maybe when one goes through this kind of life review, if one does, maybe one could see all the alternatives. You see, to me, what is beautiful about this kind of model is something where people say, well, here we are, you talk about the Holocaust, how could there be such a thing as a God? But the point about it is it's at that physical 3S, that specific time, that specific consciousness. It might be that in that life review suddenly one discovers, yeah, unfortunately there was this absolute massacre of these millions upon millions of people. But if this direction had been chosen, if one had turned right instead of left, if one had made different choices, and this is where freedom of choice comes in, and we've said it's a third time dimension, under those circumstances, maybe none of that would have happened. We have a model in terms of what I call the Neppe law of cause and effect. You can, if you change the cause, you change the effect. And Tori and I are on a group where we look in terms of precognitions and precognitions research, and sometimes we get it entirely wrong. And sometimes it is so convincing and so persuasive and so strong. One says, but how come we got it entirely wrong? Because this is how it should have been. What happened was, at that moment in time, maybe we were picking up an event in that reality along that branch, but that branch turned off. And it's more and more difficult from an individual point of view, because we can make our personal choices, but our personal choices might not necessarily impact millions upon millions of people. Now we go on TV and we start communicating, or we go on Coast to Coast Ed and we start communicating to 5 million, 10 million people, and suddenly one is making a difference in terms of that kind of picture. And there is the turnoff, and one says, we got it wrong. But we may not have gotten it wrong. It may be incorrect in terms of the events that ultimately led through, in terms of 3 dimensions of space that we're living on, with this one moving dimension of time, where the future changed. But at a 9-dimensional level, or maybe at a 3-dimensional time level, there was just this turn-off in another direction. We had moved linearly, not the way that the events were predicted to play. The impacts of all these other different consciousnesses of individuals and of all the other influences in space and time may well have changed the events. So we did not necessarily get it wrong. The cause changed, and so the effect changed. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Vernon Neppe, and it has been such a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you today.